All right, I guess we will get going and we'll let more people in as they come, but welcome everybody to the Future of Voting, a conversation on U.S. electoral reforms. I'm Elizabeth Wardle. I'm the co-president of Voter Services for the League of Women Voters of Oxford. And we are really fortunate tonight to have three panelists here to talk about this important topic. So Laura Bucci is an associate professor of political science at St. Joseph's University. Her research examines the consequences of deunionization for public policy in the United States, in the American states. Ann Whitesell is an assistant professor, soon to be associate professor of political science and the associate director of the Menard Family for Democracy here at Miami University. And she studies the intersection of representation and public policy. And she just started a really amazing e-newsletter that I recommend everyone sign up for. I will find the link while others are talking and share it with you. And then finally, Kevin Roning is an associate professor also of political science at Miami University. He uses advanced statistical methods to answer questions about campaigns, the media, and social movements. So I'm going to turn it over to them. And then the way that it will work is you know that this is a webinar, so we can't actually see you or hear you. So when you have questions, you'll put them into the Q&A here at the bottom. There's a little Q&A tab at the bottom. You can type your question. And when they're finished, I will moderate. So I will share your questions with them. And they are going to talk for about 30 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions. So thank you all so much for coming, and I'll turn it over to them.
All right, so I'm going to start just for an outline here. We're first going to talk about the history of voting, how we got here. Then we'll talk about the problems in the current system and then end with some solutions. All right, so again, going to start off with the history of voting here. So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the Electoral College. If you're not familiar, the Electoral College is outlined in the Constitution as part of Article 2, which outlines the executive branch. And so as you can see here, it says that there's going to be a number of electors to elect the president. And so this, as with many parts of the Constitution, is a compromise between having basically like a parliamentary system, if you're familiar with a parliamentary system where a prime minister is elected by other legislators, and then having a direct election from the people. So one of the things to remember is, again, in the Constitution, it's all about compromises that the framers were making, and that there was this constant kind of back and forth between giving power to the people and then this fear of giving too much power to the people. And so reserving some of that power for people who are already elected or kind of the elites. Okay, Kevin, go ahead. All right. So if we think about voting today, right, we think about going into the voting booth and casting our ballot, but that's not actually how it was done throughout a lot of history. So when the United States first started, voting was a much more communal activity. So you can see this painting here, the county election by George Caleb Bingham. And so at the beginning of the country, people went to like the town square and they publicly voted, right? And you would declare who you supported. This had the nice effect of making it kind of a communal activity, right? And so people knew that you were part of a community, you saw the effect of sharing your opinion. But as you might imagine, this also meant that some people were pressured into voting for certain people and quickly became used as a means to coerce people. There was also a lot of alcohol consumed when the voting was happening here, so that's something to keep in mind. After we moved to more paper ballots, the first types of ballots that we had were party ballots. So the political parties created their own ballots, and then you would go in and cast a ballot based on the ballot that the party gave you. Again, this is useful in some respects because if you know that you're a partisan, you just take what the party is going to tell you, but also led to some coercion and the reign of party bosses kind of trying to control people. So it's not until the Civil War that we see the rise of absentee ballots. And this was with the intention of getting soldiers actually to reelect Abraham Lincoln. He thought that by allowing soldiers to vote, that they would vote for someone who would want to end the war. And so he promoted sending absentee ballots to all the soldiers. He got reelected. We know how that ended. So we have, again, these paper ballots, right? But we don't get what's known as the Australian ballot, which is a private ballot, until the progressive era. So starting in the late 19th century. And so then we make this switch to voting being a private activity. You're not sharing who you're voting for, which again is a good thing in terms of like coercion and peer pressure, but does kind of separate the communal activity from voting and makes it less obvious kind of how your decision to vote will then affect the larger community. And as we talk from here, we can see how then your individual voice might get minimized, or you can kind of see why your vote may not matter, or you may think that your vote doesn't matter. Go ahead, Kevin. Along with the reform to move to private ballots, we also have the 17th Amendment, which leads to the direct election of senators. So according to the Constitution in its original form, senators are not directly elected by the people. Again, this is a compromise that's made with the idea being that the Senate is going to be this more tempered body than the House, which is elected directly by the people. But the 17th Amendment moves us to the direct election. And some of this is because the indirect election of senators wasn't working that well anyway. There was a lot of times where the seats would go unfilled because they'd be the subject of political gridlock in the states. There were corruption charges and kind of like the selling of seats and the buying of seats. And so the system wasn't exactly ideal. So we move, again, during the progressive era, late 19th century, early 20th century, and the 17th Amendment passes, giving people, again, another chance to directly be involved in the election of their representatives. Go ahead, Kevin. All right. And then just to wrap up here, right? So as I'm sure we're all familiar with, and not everyone had the right to vote the whole time in US history. So we have some kind of key dates here that outlines the expansion of suffrage. So suffrage originally began for white landowning men. We see that expand. The requirement that you own land falls away, and we still have white men being the ones who are solely voting. With the 15th Amendment that's passed after the Civil War, we have citizenship granted to all US men who are born in the United States, right? And then they get the right to vote. So we've kind of expanded that across to men. It's not until 1920 that women get the right to vote, right? But even then, the application of that is uneven. We know that even though the 15th Amendment was passed, obviously access to the ballot was not equal. We see plenty of voter suppression that's happening in the early 1900s. One important thing to note here is that voting is tied to citizenship, right? But for a long period in the country, there were large swaths of people who could not be citizens. So for example, American Indians were not granted full citizenship rights until the Snyder Act in 1924. People of Asian descent, depending on which particular group, right, may not have been granted citizenship until the 1950s, right? So again, if you're not a citizen, you don't have the chance to vote. And so we don't see kind of this full expansion of suffrage until more and more people are allowed to become citizens. And then with 1971 and the passage of the 26th Amendment, right? We lower the voting age to 18, right? So we over time have expanded, who is allowed to vote. There's obviously still a lot of restrictions and it's unequal access to voting, but you know, over time we have seen more and more people who are eligible to vote, even if an application that doesn't always bear out.
So I've got the task of presenting some of the problems in the current system because I am the most negative of the three of us. Um, and so we'll go from there. A lot of these start off as fairly substantial problems kind of at the base of the system, but they've expanded to bigger problems over time. Um, so malapportionment is pretty central and key to the way our political system has been constructed over time, meaning that we, in some instances, have prioritized the existence of states over where people actually live, right? So things like the Senate um, give each state two senators as a compromise with smaller states. At the beginning of this process, right? So in 1790, Virginia is the largest state and Delaware is the smallest state. But it's only by about 12 times. If we think about 2020, California itself is almost 70 times as big as Wyoming is. And so being an individual voter in one state really determines how much power that vote has. One of my favorite facts here is thinking about LA County. If we were to count LA County as a place, it would be the 11th largest state in the United States. But if we think about what voters in LA County have, they have the same two senators that everyone else does, and maybe an additional representative, right? And so if you're voting in LA County, your vote counts for less than it would in a place like North Dakota, for example. Um, and that's because of the choice we've made in how we elect the Senate and how we use the Electoral College as well, right? Which is also another thing that uses the Senate to kind of determine which votes have power. Um, so here are some of the census populations. These are all states with three Electoral College votes. So Alaska, Delaware, the District of Columbia doesn't have any voting members of Congress, which is always fun too. North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. Here, the population of LA County is about 9.7 million people, right? So significantly more. Um, and so we might wonder like how that would work if you were trying to influence political life. It'd be easier to do in a place where there are fewer people. Um, Often you see like these kind of commentaries every 4 years of an election cycle where it's like, why aren't young voters moving to North Dakota to have an outsized influence? Um, I mean, they could, right? That's an option. But the way our system's designed, that's one of the few ways that you could influence an election more directly, other than increasing the cap on the House of Representatives, which would be, you'd end up with a huge House of Representatives. Go ahead, Kevin. The second, and again, the kind of malapportionment issue is key and core to sort of how we've designed the system over time. Gerrymandering happens fairly early on. Elections are usually strategic, and the process of drawing district lines is a determined process, right? That you have to make some decisions somewhere along the way of how you're going to cut lines. And so over time, parties have decided ways that they can do this that bias towards constituencies that they want to show up. That might be racial, that might be by party, or that might be by some other characteristic. A really common one is to gerrymander your districts so that the incumbent has a safe seat in the upcoming election. Why? Because when an incumbent is on a ballot, they're more likely to win. And so therefore you end up with the same party in control of an area over time. This has grown really rapidly, very quickly. So I live in Pennsylvania, where our districts end up before the state Supreme Court pretty regularly, um, because they tend to be gerrymandered pretty blatantly, I think we could probably say. Um, what does that mean? It means that we don't expect necessarily the percentage of partisans in in a state to map on the percentage of partisans in the legislature. But it should be not so far away that you would be like, what's happening here? Right? That if we know that there's 70% Republicans in an area and they control 60% of the seats, I'd say, oh, great, fine. If they control 20% of the seats, we're like, what's going on here? And these are the kind of questions that there's formulas you could determine, et cetera, et cetera. But we know that over time, the number of competitive districts across the country has plummeted. And this is a huge issue for a few reasons. The biggest here is that having competitive elections, and by competitive elections, we mean there are two parties on the ballot, each stand a chance of winning the election. Um, Without that, there's less incentive to campaign, right? So if you don't have a competitive election, you don't really contact your constituencies, and you don't really help them to realize why you're the better candidate. The other is that there's less incentive to tell your the people you are representing what you've done. Because it doesn't really matter because at election time you're going to win your seat again and they're not going to vote for somebody else, so it doesn't necessarily matter. Less competitive districts also have lower turnout, right? So that if you know that your vote is not particularly important, then why bother? And this is a kind of situation where you see people get frustrated that you kind of have to be a little bit self-assured to think that your vote personally is going to change the result of an election, but you at least have to believe that your vote like should happen. And if that goes away, then you don't bother. This is kind of going back to what Anne said earlier, right? The idea here is that when you have a private individual ballot, there's less communal pressure to do this, right? And you could just easily be like, oh yeah, of course, I saw you, I was there, I voted, don't worry about it. And that takes away this kind of burden that other people have over time. Right, so we've got malapportionment, gerrymandering. Kevin, one more slide, one more big problem, the little buzzword of polarization. Um, so this goes along with gerrymandering. The idea that these districts are now partisan seats, but also that we've seen as like a separate problem, parties growing increasingly polarized ideologically over time. So parties want fundamentally different things. They have less room and less space that they agree on politically. And so the consequences of elections are really strong. And the consequence of like having safe districts is to create these safe spots for partisans to kind of enact this polarized agenda if they get what they want. And that's sort of it is what we've seen happen in kind of in federal politics. Um, if you look here, you see both parties kind of have grown apart from each other over time. Republicans tend to grow more conservative than Democrats, but again, both are going kind of away from each other. And why is this an issue? One is it raises the stakes of elections, but it does so without changing the structure of these elections, right? So that you are electing safe people in safe seats to go into a body that's already divided. Um, it also recruits people who like this kind of polarization, right? That if you are running for office, I talk to my students all the time about this sort of stuff, right? But they're like, oh, I would never run for Congress. And you're like, why? You're like, everyone doesn't like each other. And you're like, okay, well, if you're the kind of person who thrives off of the fight, this might be the kind of body you want to be in, right? Where you can show up every day and kind of push forward. And we see parties have elected more kind of ideologues. Um, and so part of this is they wouldn't get elected potentially if the seats themselves weren't as safe as they were. And if the primary process that elect them wasn't done by co-partisans who really wanted the kind of ideologues that were electing. Each of these problems are, in some ways, they're kind of inherent to the system that we're talking about, but in other ways, we've created all of these rules that, in some ways, prioritize uh, getting things done, right? They make it easier for parties to function. Um, but they don't have to work that way, right? It's not a thing necessarily where you would say polarization is inherent to the US political system. We've definitely helped it. And so there are ways to kind of walk that back. And Kevin's going to tell us about them.
Thank you. Hopefully, I can be a little hopeful in here. We'll see how it ends up. So, I'm going to try to talk through some different types of reform. And we've kind of divided this first, just talking about the Electoral College in general, and then talking about sort of how we actually count votes, and we'll discuss something called instant runoff voting there, and then the overall election process as well. So let's first start by talking about the Electoral College, right? And I think it is worth starting with the fact that it is technically feasible for the Electoral College to be abolished, right? Now, it's also not going to happen, right? And it's not going to happen because the way the Constitution was written, the founders put some pretty strong rules around amending the Constitution, right? So this would require two-thirds votes in both chambers, and then three-fourths of the states to ratify that. And so it doesn't seem like it's has any chance of happening in my lifetime, let's say. Um, so there are alternatives that have been identified, right? One is to change how electors are selected within the state, right? Actually, both of these are doing that, but one in a much more radical way. So the first one is creating just more proportional representation in the state. So instead of having, um, a winner take all system where all the votes go to one party or the other, you do something like what Nebraska or Maine has, where it's by congressional districts instead. And well, for most of them, and then the two remaining ones are for the statewide vote. And it is interesting to look at, what caused these things and how Nebraska and Maine have been in this situation, right? So Maine actually has done it this way since the 70s. One of the things that's maybe surprising is that also up until 2016, it didn't really matter in that whoever won Maine statewide also won all the congressional districts. And so literally it was just like it was winner take all, even though it technically wasn't. And then starting in 2016, we had Trump winning just one congressional district consistently. And so that changed a little bit of how Maine is working, or how that worked in Maine. And that actually is creating pressure for Maine to change its electoral college process. Similarly, Nebraska has been doing this since 1992, and there's been a lot of pushback on this. There's been multiple attempts to switch Nebraska to a winner-take-all system. Two of those, the only reason it failed was because a Democrat governor vetoed it. Another attempt, two Republicans in the state legislature changed their mind at the last minute, right? And this speaks to the difficulty of implementing proportional representation in states because it requires the majority party in the state to change the rules in such a way that would favor the minority party, right? So if Texas did that, it'd be great for Democrats. If California did this, it'd be great for Republicans, which is why Texas and California won't ever do this, right? Or it'd be very, very difficult without a lot of pressure from voters, right? Now, the maybe bigger reform right now that's gotten a lot of attention is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a lot of words. And every time I say it, I'm afraid I'm going to get the order of it wrong. But the way the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact works is that these states agree that if enough other states also agree to this, that their votes can sway the Electoral College, then all those states will vote along with the national popular outcome, right? So maybe to put a better example of this, if this was in place in 2016, right? States that would have voted for Trump for their electoral college would have instead told their electors to vote for Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016, right? This doesn't change the Constitution at all. It instead has the states agreeing with each other that if they do this, if enough of them do this, then they'll follow these new rules for appointing their electors, right? And this started after actually, well, about 5 years or so after 2000, the Bush Gore election, where Bush won, even though Gore won the national popular vote. And we are at the point now where there's 209 votes pledged to this, right? So the states here in blue, Washington, Oregon, California, Minnesota, have all agreed to this. Doesn't go into effect, though, again, unless enough of them agree to it that sways the vote. Now, what you might notice here is that the states in blue are also tend to be blue states, right? And this is much more popular among Democratic voters, in part because Democrats have been the ones to lose the presidential election, even though they've won the popular vote, right? Um, there is has also been pushback on this too. Colorado actually there was a voter referendum to overturn legislation about this. Uh, the referendum overturning it lost just barely, and so they kept their membership in the Interstate Compact. There's been other attempts to sort of, the states have agreed to bring them back. And there are, I'm not a constitutional lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some legal questions around this too, which I think means that if this were to actually go into effect, there would probably be um, lawsuits over it. And if it was the current Supreme Court deciding those lawsuits, I'm guessing they would decide against the Electoral Compact and say that you have to go back to the previous existing ways. And if there's questions, I can explain more where that legal argument comes from what I can gather, right? So aside from these things on Electoral College, one of the other popular reforms that's been happening right now are instant runoff or ranked choice voting. It kind of goes by both names. The mechanics of this are that instead of voting for a individual candidate, you vote for as many candidates as you want by ranking them, right? And this means that you the votes are counted in a way that after the first round, you drop the lowest person, right? So in this example here, the Libertarian candidate, John Green Bertrand, is dropped out, and his votes go to those people that have been selected second by those voters, right? So you go and vote, and you vote John Green as number one, and then Christine Havarth Gonzalez number two. And in the second round, your vote would go to Christine Havarth Gonzalez instead, right? And so on until you have a majority candidate, right? At least a majority candidate of those who voted down all those, right? Because there is one of the issues with this, as we pointed out, is that people don't have to rank everything. And so if it goes too far enough rounds, your vote might just be kind of discarded, isn't the right word, because like it's been counted in every other one. But it might not be in the total at that point, right? This has mainly been tried at local levels right now. So some cities, I'm not sure if any counties have implemented them, but definitely several cities have. New York, I think Minneapolis as well. Alaska is the only state, though they do something even more unique here, where we'll talk about here in a second, actually, because we need to talk about another thing. It's not, I think because it is relatively new, it's not as clear how much of an effect this is going to have on the actual outcomes right now. If it's leading to, more moderate or more coalition building, which is often what this is sold as creating more coalitions, right? Um, our other big reform is to change the election process by changing really how primaries work. Um, and this is through creating nonpartisan primaries, or sometimes called top two primaries. So California and Washington do this currently. And here, um, instead of having a partisan primary and then having whoever wins that primary in each party go on to a general, you have a nonpartisan primary where everyone runs, and then the top two go on to the general, right? So I mentioned Alaska does this in a weird way, where Alaska has a top four that go on from the nonpartisan primary, who are then put into an instant runoff in the general election, which I don't know why. In all honesty, they decide to go both of these, right? This has been around for about, well, California has been since I think 2010. Washington was a little bit before that. There was a lot of hope originally that this would lead to more moderate candidates winning because they wouldn't have to go through this partisan primary process. It hasn't seemingly led to that as much as people hoped. And this is in part because party elites are still pretty good at organizing outside of primaries, and they often try to stop candidates, not like legally, but they withhold support from candidates in order to make sure that their preferred candidate gets in and has the majority support from their partisans, right? And so you don't have this sort of idealized version where a moderate wins all of these because the Republican extremes um, pull people off, right? The final kind of, I don't know, more pie in the sky version of this is trying to create a proportional representation system in the United States. Lee Drutman, who's a political scientist who we've taken some of these images from, has written about ways to do this in the United States that wouldn't require like entirely reworking the Constitution. And one of his strong suggestions here is to create a larger Congress. We have a relatively small legislative body compared to the rest of the world, right? We actually have one of the smallest ones compared to the rest of the world, for our population size. And if you have more of those, more people, you have higher chances of representation through that. But also, if you do things called having multi-member districts, where each district actually elects multiple people, you can create these coalitions within districts that can have more of a sort of moderate and increase the positions people take, I guess, is the short version. And all of this is about proportional representation, is creating actually more parties. Lee Drutman is a strong proponent of more parties. The United States has a surprisingly few number of parties, and this is partially because of our electoral system. Um, and so if we have more parties, it would likely lead to increased voter turnout, as well as a few other things that would probably be good for democracy right now. And with that, I feel like I've talked a little bit too much. And so we'll go to some questions here, and then we can see where else we might want to wrap up some discussions.
Okay, thank you all. That was super interesting. I took many notes. So just for those of you who came in after I explained this, if you want to ask questions, there's a an icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can type your question in there. And we have two already, both from Kathy Brinkman. So the first one is about I can't get the name right, National Popular Vote Compact. She said, how close to it are we? How many more states must sign on?
So it's a hard thing to answer because it depends on which state to sign on. I think the short version, and Anne, you might have done more research on this, so you jump in here too, is that the real thing is it's going to start requiring less consistently democratic states to actually sign on for it to be possible, and those are the states that are the hardest ones to convince to do it, right? Anne, do you have anything to add to that, or Laura as well?
I mean, those also tend to be the states that are the most heavily benefited from malapportionment, right? So a place like, uh, I don't know, Pennsylvania or a place like Ohio, right? That like there's a lot of people, but there's not so many people that you would kind of want to go along with the popular vote necessarily.
Yeah, I would agree with what both Laura and Kevin said. So, I mean, we need 61 more electoral college votes. So that would, again, depending on the states, if you got like Pennsylvania and Ohio, you'd be like, I think about halfway there, right? But unlikely that you would get those states. So it really depends on, how many electoral college votes the states have. And um, as Kevin said and Laura said, it's unlikely that the states that benefit from the current system would want to change that.
All right, thank you all. Also from Kathy, it seems that one of the problems with ranked choice voting is that voters don't understand the process. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah.
Do you have
I
ranked choice actually, Laura?
no,
Okay,
no,
I
we
thought you
don't.
did. Sorry for a second. Yeah.
But I think this is like it's a confusing process, right? That if we think about one of the reasons why uncompetitive elections are so desirable for parties is because most people have exactly one piece of information when they go into an election booth, right? They know what party they belong to, and they know that they're going to pick it straight down the ballot. And that's like a really hard thing to convince people that they need to know more than that, especially because parties have gotten so polarized, right? That like as they polarize more, the more like it used to be the case, right? Like I'm a Rhode Islander originally, and everyone is a Democrat, right? Everyone. It's a party that encompasses Republicans. It's a party that, but they all call themselves Democrats. And so you did have to do like a little bit more work because you were like, I think they're a Democrat, but I don't know what kind. And that's changed, right? There's new parties, there's more party like diversity, and so you get kind of the choice you want. Rank choice adds complexity to that, so it makes it harder.
Okay, Jan's question is, how has the Citizens United case affected these issues, and wouldn't it be more impactful to limit political spending?
Kevin, you want to answer that one?
So I think it's complicated. Um, I'm not sure if I would call it a core problem now, right? I think it's definitely an issue. Um, I think from my perspective, the problem is almost broader than that, where money is now flowing in ways that are, I mean, this kind of goes back to Citizens United, but it flows in ways that are really hard to track. And I'm not sure if we just went back to having things pre-Citizens United, if we would see some radical change to how this works, right? I think the electoral system itself causes a lot of problems, though there is probably an interaction in here where, or maybe like a loop in here where increased money is creating these problems that are becoming worse because of the electoral system, and then that's leading to more money being spent in certain ways as well. Um, I do think it is probably a reform that needs to happen, but I think if I could only select one reform from anything for elections here, it would be moving us somehow towards a proportional representation system. And then after that, well, be first getting rid of the electoral college.
You're not going to abolish the Senate? That's the best one. Get rid of the Senate.
Yeah,
Get
maybe
them out of
that
there.
too.
Done.
Um, but it's just, yeah, I don't, Laura, Laura Ann, do you have anything to add to that? Like, it's an issue, but I think it's not as consequential as a lot of people now believe it to be, or believe it to be in general.
There is too much money in politics, for sure, full stop. Like, you're right. But I think the other thing that's happening here is that the Supreme Court has made all kinds of other like money in politics case decisions that are probably equally problematic, but less well known, right? So like allowing candidates to loan their campaigns money and then pay themselves back with their campaign money is a way to just like get rich guys to run for stuff. And so like that's a lesser known problem. The way the Supreme Court has decided like what counts as political speech and what isn't is already biased towards money. Um, and so I think like Citizens United is a bad decision. It did increase the amount of money in politics, um, in ways that make it harder to track where money is being spent, in new and separate ways.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the cat's out of the bag when it comes to containing money in politics almost. Like it's just so hard because of, like Laura said, all these, the decisions that the court has made about like, what constitutes political speech and, money being speech. It's just hard to imagine how you would contain that. And then I think about, you know, things like Elon Musk, promoting, a candidate on his social media platform. Like, how would but that's not, that's like an in-kind contribution, I guess, maybe, right? So I just think there's way too much money in politics, but I don't know how you undo that. One thing I do think that contributes to this is that our election seasons are so long in the United States. We're like perpetually in election season. If you compare that to like parliamentary systems, where there's like 6 weeks for an election season, you just don't have as much time to spend that much money. But I mean, if you look at like members of the House, they're perpetually campaigning because they're trying to get elected every 2 years.
Thank you all. So Sandy Boy Hazelton wants to know, could we start by changing things at the state level to introduce proportional representation? Have there been organizations that are trying to push this at the state level?
I'm not sure at the state level, actually, what attempts there have and have not been. Um, in part because I don't think any of them have happened in the states I've lived in, so I wouldn't be as aware of them. Um, I don't see why there would be any reason like why it couldn't happen. And there is, people don't know about this unless you study American politics. There's a lot more variation at state level elections than I think people realize, right? So like some of it, like Nebraska is just a weird state. It only has a single legislative chamber. So there's no House and Senate. It's the only state like that. It has nonpartisan legislative elections. You also have like Maryland that has multi-member districts for their lower house, I think, which is relatively unique. And then you also have like Nebraska and not Nebraska, New Hampshire and Vermont, where the chambers are gigantic compared to the population, right? Like I swear it's like 400 people in like either one of
It
them.
is
Do you?
400 people
Yeah,
in New Hampshire. It's huge. It's like more than the House of Representatives, which is
yeah.
crazy because it's New Hampshire.
And yeah, so there's definitely things that could be done at the state level. I just don't know of any off the top of my head.
The other thing that could happen is kind of like proportional representation light, where uh, kind of coalition groups can sort of endorse candidates that run under a ticket that is like affiliated with that group, and then they caucus with the party, right? So like a working families party type deal. It's not quite proportional representation, but it gets more variety in like party type than just Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, I'll just throw in, it looks like I'm on their website right now. Fair Vote, one of their uh, proposed reforms is proportional ranked choice voting. So combining two two proposals here. So that I don't know what they're doing at the state level. But they have a lot of information if you're interested. Fair Vote.
Thank you all. Next question from Sandy. I also think the population does demand more representatives in the House. Are any groups supporting this reform?
Uh, and did you know this one?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I just hear it from Lee Drutman. I didn't
Yeah.
hear it from anyone else, but
Well, and he has an organization. So there's like the New America Foundation that he's involved in.
Yeah, he was a
Um,
fellow, is a fellow there, was a fellow.
yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise me if they endorse it. But
And then I think it's called Fix America. He's an organization. And I mean, he is a big proponent of this. But I don't Fix Our House, that's what it's called. Yeah, fixourhouse.org, which is pushing for this at the national level, not the state level.
So there's another question coming, and I actually think it begs a pre-question, which is which parties have you've gone over quite a lot of history about changes to voting in this country, starting with everyone votes together and many people are drunk, and then right, there's lots of changes. Who has been behind those changes, right? So has it been one party that has been wanting the changes? What has sort of driven the changes in the past?
I mean, a lot of changes is when it's politically expedient for you, right? So if you think about like, absentee ballots, right, that was the Republicans because Lincoln thought it was going to help him win re-election. And I mean, I don't actually know if he won because of veterans, right? But he did win re-election. And I think that's often when you see reforms, right, is when you think it's going to be politically expedient for you. The problem is that oftentimes the people who are in power to make reforms are benefiting from the status quo. And so there's no need to make reforms. So we see like the progressive era is a time of change, but that didn't last forever because the Progressive Party was not one of the two major parties. That was kind of a blip in time. So I think some of that is also when there's like the national mood for change. And I don't know, maybe we're getting towards a point where there will be the national mood will be leaning towards change. But I mean, you have to get people to see it in their interest to change the system. And if the system's working for them, then it's awfully hard to do that.
I mean, I think it's Wyoming that's one of the earliest states to adopt universal female suffrage. And they do that because no women moved to Wyoming. And so it was a weird moment where it's like the ladies will flock to the state if we simply allow them to vote. And it worked enough. But I also think like we would be amiss if we didn't say that social movements kind of continually bang their head against the wall on this sort of thing. And there has to be that kind of political moment where elected people see it in their interest to change it, right? Like it's so hard to get people to change a system that works well for them, and include more people in it that might make it work less well for you.
So that was the preamble to the question that Joni had, which is why are Democrats looking for ways to change the election process if it seems like both Republicans and Democrats have had their fair share of successes? So do you feel like that's um, a current? Yeah, I'll just stop and
I
ask.
think it depends on the reform you're talking about, right? So the Electoral College has been more frustrating for Democrats than for Republicans in the last 20 some years, right? You have Bush versus Gore, you have Clinton. Um, am I missing a third one? I feel like I am. Okay. Um, and so that's made a lot of frustration over how this system works, right? But you also had, again, in the leap to 2024, Trump was pushing Nebraska a lot to change how did their electoral college because he was afraid he would lose that the blue dot in Nebraska and that it would hurt his election process prospects because of that, right? Um, and then at other levels, there's been changes as well. Iowa just changed how they do redistricting, right? Um, which is something that Governor DeWine here has talked about doing as well after the loss of the issue one. I can't remember what issue number it was in the fall, right? He talked about doing that instead, right? So parties respond to a combination of what they think will help them win and with what will help them, what voters are demanding, right? And so when voters are demanding change and have ability to push that change that from the below, they will respond to that. And then they will also respond to things that they are concerned about that might threaten their power, right? And like again, the Senate, the way it's set up right now, and it's not like it has to be this way, right? There's no reason, written into law that smaller states or less populous states have to vote Republican. It's just been the way recently, and so it's led to Democrats being more interested in reforming the Senate because of that, right? And you can have your own feelings about if it's good or bad to have states represented opposed to having people represented in the Senate, right? But that's kind of where the interest is coming from. I was just watching a video of my class recently that had a senator from a Democratic senator from Idaho, Church, Senator Church, and I was thinking to myself about, I wonder when the next time there'll be a Democratic senator from Iowa or from Idaho, right? These things aren't in stone, though. I don't know if Laura or Ann have things to add there.
I mean, I think it's worth thinking about that all of the gerrymandering cases that have made their way to the Supreme Court have been Republican-led efforts, right? Like, I think there's something to say about that, right? So if we think of North Carolina or Georgia or Pennsylvania or a pretty long list of states. So I don't think it's like an even split in terms of like how parties are using districts to win electoral seats. And I think the concern, kind of outside of party, is that we want as many people to participate in elections to make them as valid as possible.
Well,
Um,
and just to add, I mean, it's mainly been Democratic states that have created citizen-led initiatives to do redistricting or voter-led initiatives to redistricting. And there's a few Democratic states that don't have that. And you could add into that?
Well, I
Or
was just going to jump in and say, like, when I talk to my students about gerrymandering, I always give them the example of Maryland, which is where I'm from, which is very heavily gerrymandered in
right,
favor of Democrats. And
right.
so this is not just a Republican, led issue, right? Democrats do it too because it's politically expedient for them, right? That's how you maximize the number of House seats that you get, out of Maryland for Democrats, right? Is by gerrymandering. So it's definitely, I think Republicans lean more towards it, but you can definitely find examples of both parties doing it. And I think that's true for a lot of these things
It's
where,
like polarization, right? Where it's
right,
like everyone's doing it, but not everyone is doing it as much.
right,
Um,
exactly.
Or not everyone is doing it as much right now. And I think part of the benefit of what you've given us tonight is a much longer view, which I don't know if it made me feel better or worse to see the longer view. It's like we've screwed things up many, many times, but also we have tried new things, which seems interesting to remember. So I have one more question. It's 7:54. So, the League of Women Voters cares a lot about voter education. So I was deeply traumatized by one of your comments, which is that I think it was Laura's, that
Sorry.
voters go to the polls with one thing in their mind, which is their party. And the League of Women Voters publishes the voter information guide, and it's nonpartisan. And our whole point is to get them to be educated about all the things. So I'm very curious if you have any thoughts about how to change voter education and awareness.
Those guides work. Those guides are good, right? Like that, like don't. So not everyone is getting them, right? So first, that's like a separate thing. But I think we know that in states where, like California, for example, mails out a nonpartisan guide to the election, and we know that those work well, right? I can't do anything if you get a thing mailed to your house and you throw it in the garbage. I can't fix that. But I think of the people who read them, it does help on a kind of large scale. So I think prioritizing easily accessible, available information will change how people vote. The question is whether people think that they need to know that information, or if they already are convinced that like the vibes are flowing through them and they're ready to go to the polls as is.
Well, and I think one of the reasons why people use partisan cues is because it like lessens the burden for you in trying to find all the information, right? And so like guides that the League of Women Voters provides centralizes information. And so that can be useful, right? Because again, you're going to like one source for information, right? The amount of, when we think about, and this is an exercise I do with my students, right? You think about all the things that you have to think about when it comes to voting in the United States. From like, did I register to vote? Do I have the right ID? Do I know where I have to go? Do I know when the polls are open? Like all of these things. And then you add on top of that, oh yeah, do I know what I'm actually voting for? Like that's just a lot of cognitive load, especially when you're talking to college students. And there's all these other things going on in their heads. So like the idea of then having to go out, and especially in like a fragmented media environment, and figure out like where is the reliable information, that's just like too much for people to handle. And so it is easier to just say like, I'm just going to vote straight, on the partisan ticket, because that's one less thing that I have to worry about. But if there are, nonpartisan guides easy to access for people, that also helps lessen the cognitive load.
And just to add one more thing, because I think this is something that political scientists have a very different perspective than maybe a lot of voters, because a lot of literature shows that like for most voters in most cases, partisanship is a good enough metric for them. Like they would vote the same way if they had more information, right? That doesn't mean though that that's the case for all voters and for all situations, and it depends a whole lot, right? Like I have a PhD in political science. I study American politics. I look at the League of Women Voter Guide for issues that I don't know a lot about, or for candidates I don't know a lot about, especially on like nonpartisan stuff, or ones that don't have partisan, yeah, are nonpartisan. And even if that like not everyone else is looking at that. One of the things people do as well is they rely on people that they trust that they have similar values for, right? And so like I've had friends ask me how they should vote, not because they like don't care or because they'll vote however I say, but because they've known me for a while and they can um, trust me to tell them what they think they need, right? And that kind of information is helpful and is really helped by those sorts of things. And one thing we wanted to do here at the end quickly is we actually put together some reading because we thought that this would be the kind of audience that would like reading recommendations. And so we wanted to put those up here on the screen too. I didn't want to share that. I wanted to do slideshow. So if anyone's looking for more information here, we mentioned Lee Drutman multiple times in here, but there's also a book by Robert Alexander, who is a professor also in Ohio. I can't remember
He's at Bowling Green
Bowling
now.
Green now on the Electoral College, and then this book, Ground War Courts, Commissions, and the Fighting Over Partisan Gerrymanders, as well is a good source too. And so people looking for more information, these are great places to go.
Great. Well, we have 1 minute. And so Kathy had a question, and if I could ask you each to answer it, but with one thing, here it is. It's our final words. What's the one reform you personally think would be most impactful or that you would like to see?
Proportional representation.
I already said get rid of the Senate. So I'm standing by it.
I'm gonna make mine more complicated, which is sorry, Anne. Get rid of primaries and make parties stronger because we actually need stronger parties in this country. They're too weak as organizations right now. But that's for a different talk, maybe.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so very much for coming tonight. And thank you to Kevin and Laura and Anne for taking time out on a Wednesday to do this work for us. And we hope to see you at other league events in the near future. Thanks, everyone.